Hi, good evening. Joy, welcome to this Facebook Live. I hope there are people there. Everyone is very welcome. When this Facebook Live was originally scheduled, of course, I had no idea that it would be as dramatic a news day as it had turned out to be. I posted a story on the Atlantic webpage and about today's dramatic revelations, and I invite you to take a look at it if you have not already. But perhaps that's the place to begin. Let me start by talking about my reaction, not because I aspire to be any kind of guru, but because here I am and here you are, to the allegations against Justice to be Justice nominee Brett Kavanaugh. Let me start by saying I was not opposed to Kavanaugh nomination. I'm broadly in sympathy with his judicial philosophy. If it were up to me, Roe v. Wade would not be overturned, but on most other issues, I probably see more or less the way he does. And at this point, I certainly don't think that there is enough shown to suggest that there's any reason that he shouldn't join the court. But we do have an incredibly serious allegation. It deserves to be heard. We need to the extent it can be done, to ascertain the facts. And as difficult as it is to ascertain the facts, it will be very nearly as difficult, maybe even more difficult, to figure out what to make of them. Supposing it is all true, what do we think about that? For me, I am confronted today with, sorry, my wife has just kindly brought me a cup of coffee to sustain me this. Thank you.
And some bourbon.
Thank you. Thank you. The questions are not yet that hard. But
Well, I realize that bourbon for you is a new thing. And so I'm ashamed to say I don't know really how you take your bourbon. I put ice cubes in it, but do you have water or just ice cubes?
Thank you. That's perfect. And all right, now, so a little more cinema, more verite of the cinema verite than.
Joy, darling, hello to your fans.
Thank you. Okay, and I'm blushing. That doesn't usually happen around here. I just want to be clear about that. That was a little scene from Right Ho Jeeves. We don't know what happened. That's going to be difficult to find out. And it's difficult to know what to make of it. The thing I am sure of is that the all-male Judiciary Committee of the Senate and this extraordinarily unrepresentative Republican Senate is a bad place to adjudicate it. I mean, I think about this from just this point of view. So male, reasonably large, reasonably fit. I've never met Dwayne Johnson. Until I do, I don't think I've ever encountered anybody who was able to hold me on the floor if I did not want to be held there. But it's hard for someone like me to enter appropriately into the imaginations of people for whom the kind of thing that has just been alleged is a real allegation. And the idea that your fundamental rights and liberties as an American, as a citizen and a human being, are in the hands, or 1/9 in the hands, of someone where you're not sure whether he was that kind of person, that has to be a pretty terrible thing. So we need really to get to the bottom of this. And until we're quite sure that it's not true, or until we're quite sure that society says, look, what you did at 17 is not relevant to the person you are at 53, I don't think this thing should go forward. And the voices that need to be heard from as we decide whether this thing is true, and whether, if true or maybe true, because we'll never know for sure, whether it's forgivable, I don't think the Senate Judiciary Committee and even this current Senate majority are in a position to do that. Every member of that Republican Senate caucus of 51, the 51 majority, has in one way or another endorsed and seemingly voted for President Donald Trump, who is a confessed sexual assailant. You don't get to be a Republican unless you can't be a Republican unless you in the Senate, unless you've agreed beforehand that a record of sexual assault, confessed sexual assault, is no bar to the highest office in the land. And those are the people who are going to be voting on the confirmation of the next highest office in the land. So I think there's a strong case for going slow, really understanding this, and maybe having a somewhat different Senate with a wider public participation, give a mandate one way or the other. Voters can be very forgiving of a lot of bad actions by politicians. I worked for a president who had an arrest for driving under the influence of alcohol. One of the people I most admired in public life, in both starting the Bush administration, was Mitch Daniels, two-term governor of Indiana, who was arrested as an undergraduate with an industrial scale drug possession, 2 shoeboxes of marijuana and a whole pharmacopoeia of other things. He thought his political career was over at age 22 when he was caught, but the voters of Indiana elected him to 2 terms. They made their peace with that. He was completely candid about what had happened. He was forthright. He made the appropriate apologies. Voters can be forgiving. So let's put this to the people. Let's hear from as many people as possible. Let's have a broad discussion. Let's not be hasty and run this through. All right, thank you. So I'm here now. That's my opening. Those are my opening comments, senators. And now I'll take questions. Let me start with some that have come in early. And here's one that is very appropriate to this question of forgiveness. Do you still believe that imprisoning people for using or growing marijuana is the sound or just government of free people? I have never been in favor of imprisoning people for marijuana. I've always been, one of the reasons I got involved with the anti-drug group SAM that I was involved with was precisely because SAM was about finding alternatives to incarceration. Incarceration and even arrest is a terrible thing to do to people. It makes them look at the law entirely different from for the whole rest of their lives. And so the challenge to me of drug control policy is to find a way to, without legalizing and putting drugs in the hands of people, to divert people away from the criminal justice system. So I remain obviously Canada, my native country, and where I spend a lot of time, is committed to an experiment with legalization. Many American states are the same. We'll see how it goes. My instinct is that those experiments will not be successful, and we will need to try new approaches. But I do believe that while you want to make marijuana scarce and keep it out of people's hands, that prison and arrests, even arrests without prison, are absolutely the wrong answer. I'm coming to that. I don't know if this is from the same person. They suggest, hopefully you avoid the topic of gluten, of which you've displayed your ignorance in a spectacular fashion. Okay, this I am fighting about. Gluten is a protein. If you leave the gluten out of your bread, you just turn your bread into totally empty carbohydrate. The reason you can keep living on bread is because of the gluten. If, like 1% of the population, you're genuinely allergic to it, you should avoid it. If you're anybody else and you're avoiding your gluten, you're making a big mistake. You're omitting the healthiest part of the bread. And those are, I'm really prepared to go toe to toe on that question. Let me see. Okay. This is the very first question that came in. I think it should have an answer. Would a post-Trump GOP, in your view, be receptive to a less immigration and more healthcare policy if, say, Trump was removed from office and Mike Pence became the president? Would this have to come from the Democrats? Do you see a post-Trump GOP with policy positions more in line with Mike Pence or you, or more in line again with Jeb Bush or Paul Ryan in the past? So questions like that are exceedingly difficult to answer because I don't think we get from here to there in a linear way. I think we are going to go through a period very like that 1968 to 1974, where the whole party system gets reshuffled. Depending on how all of this goes and how all this ends, we are going to come out of the Trump era with a political system that looks very different from the pre-Trump. One thing I think we know, and especially if the president is as out of control in the next 48 hours confronting these allegations like he may be, that we are going to discover an incredible gender line in American politics. There's what, a 46-point gender gap it's like the gender gap among college-educated white women against the president. It's so overwhelming. You know, I see this in my own. I'm sure many of you have seen this in your own families. I mean, I remain a registered Republican, but there's not a woman anywhere in my ambit in my family who still is. And that exodus, soon to be a total deluge of women with education out of the Republican Party, it's going to mean the party system post-Trump looks very different and very hard to make predictions now about what that is going to look like. All right, so let me look. I'm hearing some clicks on my email. I'm not hearing them too, but I probably have not set that properly to see whether questions come in that want to be answered while I've been talking. A woman named Hillary says, should there be term limits on Supreme Court justices? Yes, I think this is a fantastic idea. This is, as you know, as Hillary, you may know, a proposition that's been advanced by a number of people of a 19-year term limit for justices, staggered. That would ensure that every president who served 8 full years would appoint the same number of Supreme Court justices. It would get the justices, it would prevent the problem that we've had in the past of justices overstaying. We have had since about 1970 a problem of justices who had deteriorating mental faculties. That happened with William O. Douglas, and it's happened with one or two others, where the judges really, the people around them noticed that the judge was not as sharp as he or she used to be, but the judge himself didn't believe it. It's a mercy, it's a blessing. We live much longer than we used to do, but we outlive our energy. And then you get problems of justices timing their exits for partisan advantage. You get this question, as we have now, over the retirement of Justice Anthony Kennedy. Did he retire as part of a deal with Trump, that if Trump would promote his favorite clerk into his chair, that he would go early? I think a 19-year limit to take into account the much longer life expectancy of the 21st century, that would be a good thing. Bill asks, would you support creation of a new centrist political party? I think this is just an unrealistic idea. There's a fantastic new paper published by the Democracy Fund. The problem is everyone, when they say new centrist political party, imagines it'll be a party that appeals to them. But the center means many different things to many different people. I think what we've discovered is, while there have been very successful third parties in American history, they've tended to be single issue third parties focused on an issue that the other parties don't want to deal with: slavery, temperance, deflation in the 19th century, socialism. And what has happened is the third party comes along and presents a new third party idea. And if it's successful enough that the third party begins to go places, then the existing parties steal that idea and integrate it into them. It is easier to change one of the two big existing parties than to create a new party. And so long as we have the Electoral College, I think that will continue. What would you need? Heidi asks, what would you need to hear on this accusation in order for you to oppose Kavanaugh? If the accusation were true, if that were probably true, and given that and if I believe that Judge Kavanaugh denied it in knowledge of its truth, that would horrify me. And if I heard from him any attempt to justify this, one of the questions I've had is, Brett Kavanaugh's gone through a number of Senate confirmed positions. He held very important positions in the Bush White House. It's hard for me to imagine that he had absolutely no memory of this thing. And the thing I don't understand is why at no point in his ambitious public career, he never reached out to this woman and said, when we were young, I did something I'm very ashamed of. I'm grateful that because of the intervention of my friends, it didn't become more serious than it was. I can only imagine how it was for you. And let's keep talking about this until we arrive at some kind of resolution. Why did he not reach out and seek some kind of reconciliation and forgiveness? Maybe he was so drunk that he has absolutely no recollection of this, but at some point along the way, he had friends there that they must have understood. And as he was thinking about, how do I go from, the staff secretary at the White House to an appellate court, the DC court, I have my eye on the Supreme Court. Let me just review my own life and make sure it's everything the life of a Supreme Court justice should be. And people are not perfect, but where I've done wrong, we're coming up to the Jewish High Holy Days. And I think one of the most profound, my favorite teachings of the holiday is the prayers insist again and again. You can only ask God to forgive you for wrongs against God. If you haven't, and if you agree these are, but if you haven't kept kosher, if you have violated Shabbat, or you've done something like that is so a violation of Jewish religious law, then you can go to synagogue and pray to God and he will forgive you. But it says again and again, for sins against fellow human beings, God alone cannot forgive. You must get the forgiveness from the fellow human being first. And then only after you have the forgiveness of the person whom you have wronged, only then can you ask God to forgive you for that same offense. And that seems to be pretty, sensible wisdom. Why he made no effort to get reconciliation with this girl. We're young, and there's a lot of time, and she doesn't sound angry. She sounds like someone who's damaged and is seeking some kind of healing for herself. I wonder if back when he first went to the DC Appellate Court, in 2005, if he had reached out, whether he wouldn't have gotten a hearing. What about believing that POTUS cannot be prosecuted while in office? I think this is right. I mean, this is not a grant of immunity. I don't think the way you should hear this is a sitting president cannot be indicted. I think the way you should hear this is the logic of the constitutional system is that if the president has committed indictable offenses, the president must be removed first and only then indicted. And the reason for that is just logic. The president is head of the whole system of law enforcement. The system will crash and will be exposed to terrible temptations if the president is in charge of the system while it's investigating it. So I adhere, and I think this is the conventional view among lawyers, not that the president is immune to prosecution, but the order is removal first, indictment next. What are your thoughts on Senator Flake's statement? Unfortunately, I have not seen that statement yet. So you know what happens when you do these things is you are all better informed now because it's been a whole 16 minutes. So I've been reading your questions. You've been reading Twitter. You know more. You are 16 minutes better informed than I am about everything in the world. So I don't know what that statement is. Why not three parties like in Canada? Because of the Electoral College. That as the election of 2000 showed, that as long as there's an Electoral College, if you vote for if there are three parties and you vote for your favorite party, you help the party you dislike most. And so long as the whole fundraising system is based around the president is elected through the Electoral College, then that will be true all the way down the system. I mean, you would need very large changes to American law to make a three-party system work. So founding the third party is only the beginning. You need a new voting system, and ultimately you need an answer to the Electoral College, and that's embedded in the Constitution and very hard to change. So, let's see here. Oh, I've got questions about Michael Bloomberg and Michael Avenatti as Democratic candidates. I spent my life in the Republican Party. I can sort of, I understand it. I don't really have that kind of in my fingers knowledge of the Democratic Party, of how Democrats respond to things. I do know as sort of a general, I have observed the Democrats are more likely to fall in love with an absolute newcomer to politics than Republicans are. So pre-Trump, and even Trump had been around for a while. The successful Republican candidates for president have been around for a while, whereas the Democrats, Obama was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2004, and in 2008 he's president, and so it goes through history that they are much more open to completely new people than Republicans are. So, I mean, I don't really understand exactly how it works. So the questions I've got here are about Bloomberg and Avenatti. Bloomberg, I'm sure, will not work. That he's just too conservative, and I mean, the great question about Bloomberg is, I mean, he's such in a more rationally organized political system, he would be a natural Republican. And maybe somebody like him can't quite be president, but he was elected mayor of New York. Why couldn't he be governor of New York? And then he would be very much in the tradition of the liberal to centrist Republicans that have often been governors of northeastern states. I mean, he is somebody who's sympathetic to markets, likes the financial industry. I think he is just too economically conservative for where the Democratic Party is now. Avenatti, I can't read that. I mean, I'm tempted to join the Inside the Beltway dismissal and to say he just seems too obviously self-seeking. But he's a fantastic TV presence. He is exciting. He is a fighter. He may be what the Democrats are in the mood for, especially as this thing goes on and Democrats absorb that their first tier of candidates are pretty elderly. I hope this isn't too mean a joke, that the Democratic Party's operational slogan for 2020 is 90 is the new 70. They're not 90 yet, but I think Kerry, Biden, Sanders, I don't think quite Warren. All of them will be, if they complete, if they're elected in 2020 and serve a full term, they will be over 80 when they finish their first term as president. And that just strikes me as not realistic, especially for the men. Sorry to say this, but I just, men, we go off the cliff awfully fast. I mean, it's fine, and then boom, we're drooling. So that it just seems awfully old. And when you look at the people who are not going to be 80 in 2025, that's a short list, and it's not a compelling list. I mean, I think Kamala Harris, I just don't. She's very much a creature of the financial industry. She's reinventing herself, but she is very much a mainstream establishment, Clinton-style Democrat, or was until 10 minutes ago. And I'm not sure that's where the party is. I think the energy that that supported Bernie Sanders in 2016 goes somewhere. What it's going to be looking for is someone more face forward. I don't know. I mean, it seems incredible to me, but it's not my party. I don't know its psychology. It strikes me as less impossible than a lot of people. I just see something on the screen. Somebody said, "I wish Mitch Daniels were president." Boy, I wish James Mattis were president. We wish a lot of things, but all right. Let me go through these screens here because these are coming in faster this way. There's would I ever run for office? I'll admit I've sometimes thought about it, especially a more weirdly. The offices that have always most excited me are more local. It would be an interesting thing to be mayor of the District of Columbia, but I've published a lot of words, and I will confess I don't remember all of them. And sometimes I read things I've written and that's pretty good. But a lot of the time I read them, So if I read things I've written in the past and go, I have to imagine that people are less sympathetic to me than I am. They will go double. So generally, people who publish millions and millions of words are not strong candidates for public office, and I publish millions and millions of words. What is it? How can the GOP appeal more to women? Many see the abortion issue as anti-women. What Republican proposals can really appeal to women? Maternity leave, business proposals. I think one of the things that's generally true about politics is when you have a problem like this, it's not about the policy. The Tablet magazine, a wonderful online magazine of Jewish life, found an audio recording of a roast tape that John McCain did for Joe Lieberman when Joe Lieberman left the Senate. And it's hilarious. It's absolutely hilarious. And in the course of the tape, McCain over and over again mocks Joe Lieberman's Orthodox Judaism. And it's hilariously funny. And the room finds it hilariously funny. And the reason is that they have this profound understanding. This is a friend. And now he's going to make fun of some of the things we do that's absurd. His opening joke, as he said, I've traveled so much with Joe Lieberman that we spent so much time together that I've decided after all this time, I think I need to convert to Orthodox Judaism. And not because I'm so attracted to the faith, although I find the faith very admirable, but because McCain says, I've had to put up with so much of the bullshit already, I might as well go the whole way. And then he does this mocking speech about Orthodox Jewish ritual, and the room is in stitches because they know he's a friend. He sees us the way we see ourselves. He cares for us. We also recognize our own absurdities. We'll take it and we'll enjoy it. All of those same jokes would have been profoundly offensive if they had come from someone in a different place. So much of politics is about creating that sense of, I'm with you, I've got an affinity. And then you don't get a hearing until people know you're on their side. And so the Republican problem is, it doesn't matter what the policies are. Donald Trump, Roy Moore, those are the most extreme cases, but there's so many. The very fact that this Kavanaugh thing that even happened that one of the things you did not ask in this era of Me Too is, are you completely sure there's never been a time in your life when uh, there's a disconnect there, and until you close that with real sympathy, policy proposals are not going to do it. That's the old. It's a political cliche, but it's true. People don't care what you know until they know that you care, and that's the Republican problem with all of these groups that are against their party. That you have these people like Paul Ryan who keep thinking, well, we could do this with a tax credit. No, it won't work. People don't care about that until they know that you're fundamentally on their side. And once they know that you're on their side, then they'll hear a lot of strange things. And you can tell no to people who know that you're sorry, won't do that. They can't do it. But that's the answer. Is that this is a party that has turned, and what the president is about to do, and the defenders of Brett Kavanaugh are about to do. I mean, that's just going to ice the cake. Coffee, then bourbon, says yeah, exactly. I need both. Okay. What am I? I thought. Wait a second. These are now coming in too fast. Let me try this on the phone. Forgive me. I'm going to read them here and see if I can make more sense out of them this way. Why do you think Manafort agreed to cooperate? Of course, I don't know. I think that first night in prison must be quite an experience. I mean, if you've ever been inside a prisoner jail, I mean, they're noisy, they're weird, and disorienting and disturbing. And even to go in as a visitor, and you're there for some time, you think, well, what would it be like to go to bed that night and realize that's it, and this is the rest of your life? And that it's true that the Trump people were conducting this in the open negotiation with Manafort about maybe there's a pardon coming, but the pardon hasn't come yet. And if you're Manafort, you have to wonder. And maybe if you're also Manafort, you say, I don't need a pardon. I need a whole witness protection program, because the secrets I have to spill don't just affect Donald Trump. They affect very dangerous people in the former Soviet Union. And so you need a much more comprehensive deal, not just a pardon, but a whole new life, whole new security system. So I think that may be it. Plus, I think the thing that there may be family issues too. That one of the things that's interesting about Manafort is the shame and pain he's caused his family. I believe he has 2 daughters, and if he vanishes into a prison and spends the rest of his life there, there's never any opportunity to sort of close that gap and change the way they see him. Beyond that, I can't guess. Trump's core base seems to be loyal to him no matter what he says or does. Will they stay with him if he signs to some form of immigration amnesty in exchange for a wall agreement sent to him by a Democrat-controlled House and Senate? So that's questions a lot of moving parts. First, yes, Trump's base is loyal to him no matter what. You don't lose in politics because you lose your base. 1932, Americans were literally going hungry. I believe Herbert Hoover got 38% of the vote that year. The base did not desert. There are a lot of people who say, well, I don't like going hungry, but Herbert Hoover is very sound on the prohibition question, and I'm still mad about the Civil War. So I'm going with Hoover despite being hungry. But that was 38%. That left a lot of people over who didn't go with him. So if Trump loses power, he will not lose it because he loses his base. He will lose it because just enough suburban Republicans, especially women, desert him to tip the electoral map in a different way. And when it does tip, because he's so unpopular in the total popular vote, that small shift in the key places can precipitate a big disaster. Trump's base, I think, has shrunk a little bit. I imagine will shrink more if there's an acceleration of inflation. I think this is one of the more underwatched stories. But over the summer, the consumer price index rose at an annualized rate of 2.9%. For those of us who are children of the 70s, that's not such a shocking number. But what it has meant is that for a lot of people, their wage increases have not kept up with the price of the things they buy, especially food. And I'll admit I'm not totally in touch with the struggles of the everyday person. I don't know what the price of milk is, but a lot of people care and know and feel it. And every time I write about this, I hear from people saying, I used to do the grocery shopping and fill the car, and now I do the grocery shopping and fill the car 3/4 of a tank because I can't quite afford to do both. And I think that's going to be important if the inflation accelerates under the pressure of these gigantic deficits and Trump's trade war. Uh, Will they stay with him if he signs on some form of amnesty in exchange for a wall agreement sent to him by a Democrat-controlled House and Senate? It's very hard for me to imagine that there will be any percentage for a Democrat House and Senate to do deals with Donald Trump. I think that it's going to be all investigations all the time. And I don't think Trump is actually serious about the immigration issue. I think the wall has become a symbol of exclusion of the external world, along with the tariffs. But I don't think he's ever thought rationally about immigration for 5 minutes. I mean, if you did, I'm someone who believes that the United States should be taking not zero immigrants, but not as many as it's taking now. 1.1 million legal and about 2/3 that many illegal. I think the number should look more like they did in the 1980s, about 580, 600,000 a year legal and enforcement of illegal. If you care about those things, the wall is the stupidest possible idea. It will cost vast amounts of money. It doesn't affect people who overstay their visas. The place to do immigration enforcement is at the workplace, and that's a view pretty widely shared among people who care about this issue. Trump is looking for a symbol, and it's a symbol of isolation. But I can't imagine. I don't see the Democrats dealing with him. Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump may imagine such a thing, but they're deluding themselves. I don't think they have any idea of what's coming their way should the Democrats win both House and Senate. Okay, the Republicans are on the wrong side of history in opposing Medicare for all. This is an idea first originated by John Stuart Mill, now 160 years ago, that Mill made the point that it's possible for the government to guarantee something without the government providing something. In those days, he was talking about universal elementary education, that his vision was that everyone in England should have 8 years of education, but the government should not provide it. Mill was a school inspector, by the way. That's part of how he made his living. That the government should not provide it. The government should guarantee it. And he didn't use terms like a voucher system, but he had something like that in mind. You'd have church schools, independent schools, all kinds of schools. The government would make sure that everybody could go, but the government would not be the provider. And the problem with Medicare for All is it puts the government's not quite the provider, but it puts the government so much in charge of how the system works. And I understand Medicare for All is kind of a shorthand, but a lot of the troubles in the American healthcare system come about because of the Medicare system. The way Medicare pays doctors is Medicare creates this giant a la carte menu. It's like being at the world's biggest French cafe. And there are thousands of operations, each are in healthcare thingies, each of which has its own code. And the government sets a price. And when you go to the doctor checks off how many of those Medicare codes, and they go through the a la carte menu, and that's your bill. And that then feeds back through the rest of the healthcare system, because most of the people who see a doctor on any given day are Medicare patients. So the doctor will not have one set of billings for the small minority of his patients and the small minority of the services that he provides that are non-Medicare, and a different one for the large majority that is Medicare. He will do the Medicare billing system for all the rest of his practice. And that means that what you get is Medicare has been an important driver in converting the American healthcare system into not a healthcare system at all, but into a medical services provision system. That it is set up to get everyone thinking about what services do the doctors provide, and that's how we pay for it. Medicare is indifferent to outcomes. It's very hard for Medicare to know whether these things are working. If a doctor has a practice of patients over 65, and he inspires them to eat better and to exercise and to take care of their health, and as a result, very few of them see him very often, he will make himself poor. Maybe he'll put himself out of business. Exactly the things that we want to happen are the things that Medicare disincentivizes, which is being as healthy as possible with as few possible visits to the doctor. So I think Medicare is fundamentally quite a broken system. It was designed in the middle 1960s for when healthcare meant visits to the hospital. And we need a new way of thinking about care for the elderly that is about keeping people active as long as possible into their lives, and then making the period of sickness, not making that as long and lengthy and expensive as possible. My friend Jonathan Rausch says that Americans uniquely torture all of their elderly to death, but focuses on health, true health, as the measure of success. And that's going to need a very different kind of concept from the one that's embalmed in Medicare for vintage 1965. What do we got here? What else got here? Logged into the 15-minute mark. Did I miss the Kavanaugh discussion? I'm afraid that was at the top, but if there are more Kavanaugh questions come in, I'm happy to deal with them. But this will all be, I think, available for replay later. Also, I wrote an article about it that put my thoughts into more compact, concise form. Okay, there's a discussion here going on about female candidates. I will skip that. Oh yeah, here we go. Hi from north of Napanee, Ontario. What do you think of Woodward's book? I haven't even received it. I mean, it's so sad. I pre-ordered it, and it hasn't even been delivered yet. We are past the pub date. I have mixed feelings about Woodward. I always have a feeling that Woodward. I think any quote that's in a Woodward book is accurate and reliable. I think he gets the big things right. But there is a kind of artistic impulse in Woodward where I think he shapes narratives to make them more dramatic in ways that are probably not literally true. And that bothers me. I haven't read this new book yet. No one's objected to it, but they're in other books, and famously, you can look it up. My friend Tim Mack did a great piece about this for the Daily Beast, the flower pot scene in the Watergate books. And there are things there you say, it looks like there's a certain shaping of the narrative to make it juicier that has always sort of troubled me. Okay. Hi there. Hi. Oh, my wife's back here.
I'm just listening.
Oh, okay. Come on. All right. What else have we got here? The wall is off the base. Prospects for Canada in NAFTA. I think that I have a feeling the NAFTA negotiations are coming to a culmination, and I have to say, I'm not a supporter of the Trudeau government, not a fan of Trudeau at all, but I do think they have played this one rather well. And I think what they have figured out is Trump is obsessed with the idea that the way to be reelected president is to win Wisconsin again a second time in 2020. And he has convinced himself the way to win Wisconsin is to get a deal on milk and cheese. And I mean, both of these are quite false premises, but he believes it. And that means that these dairy subsidies in Canada, and the Canadian dairy system, utterly indefensible, and no one in Canada, except people who directly benefit, does defend it. But that this has taken on a significance in his mind so utterly. The NAFTA, I think the U.S.-Canada trade is now nearly $1 trillion a year, which is, if it were a single economy, it would be almost as big as Spain. And in this $1 trillion a year economy, I think dairy subsidies, the whole dairy industry in Canada is maybe $8 billion. So that's like a tenth of a penny. But Trump is fixed on it. And the Trudeau people sort of figured out he's obsessed with this thing. And so when you're negotiating with somebody who is obsessed on something that you have, what you do is you sort of clutch it and you say, this thing, you shine it. Say, this is, the rarest jewel. I would never part with this. I mean, there's no price you could pay them. It's the most beautiful thing ever. There's no price. And as you notice, he's getting ever more fixed. He says, well, maybe if you give me this, and maybe if you give me that. And then at the end, you let him win. And I think they're getting ready for a big Donald Trump, you beat us. Your magnetism, your negotiating skill, your power, how can we say no? You've won. You got the dairy thing, which Canada gave away in the TPP 15 years ago. But you got the dairy thing, and then everything else falls into place, and that's the NAFTA deal. I think that's the direction in which this is going. Would you ever consider living in Canada? I have a house. My wife and I have a house in Prince Edward County, and we were there for a lot of the time. we're at the point where we have begun to talk about questions like, so, darling, where would you like to be buried? And I think we will probably end up there. So it may be my home for a long, long, long time. Let me see. Can you turn down the volume of that alarm bell? It's twice as loud as your voice. Good point. I don't think there's a way to. I'd have to turn off. Actually, there's a way to do that. I exit the mail program. Okay, that's off. Thank you. Thoughts on midterms? A viewer asks. So the lesson that every pundit in Washington has taken from 2016 is Republicans do better than you think. To my mind, the lesson from 2016 is, the mid-course projection. Whatever you get as projections is the upper bound, lower bound, mid-bound, and you always think the mid-bound is the most probable. The mid-bound is not the thing. While the most probable is not guaranteed to happen. And so there is, I think, the mid-bound course is that the Democrats do well in the House of Representatives, 25 to 30 seats, but can't take the Senate. I don't think we're thinking enough about the prospects that are suddenly, after Kavanaugh, a lot more real of a massive Democratic win. And in particular, if the Republicans and the president, and I should say, I think the Republicans have enough sense, but if the president unleashes on this accuser of Brett Kavanaugh in the way that he, check out sex tape in the way he has done in the past, I think we could see that gender gap go, and I think that could precipitate a real deluge. I am much more likely to think, when I think about the Senate, of Democratic gains in places like Indiana and Tennessee than Texas. But if Trump goes all out against the Kavanaugh accuser, the Houston suburbs could shift, and in that case, it's not impossible the Republicans lose Senate, lose Texas too. I've got a couple of questions about Ontario politics. So I'm not going to go there tonight, not because I don't have views and not to dodge the question, but through our marriage, my wife has often complained that we'll go to some event or some party and she will find me in a corner just haranguing people about Canadian politics, some of them willingly and some of them less willingly. And I've had to explain to her that the thing about Canadian politics is it's just much more, once you get into it, it's very fascinating, but a lot of people are not willing to make that initial commitment to get into it. And some of them may be viewing tonight. So I am conscious of the non-Canadian element of the audience. And so I'm going to want to keep Canadian. I will talk about NAFTA, but when we're into Ontario and notwithstanding a Premier Ford, I'll be able to feel like people clicking off all over Facebook Live. I have a question. This is actually the file here that came in early about the idea of a guaranteed income. And there's some candidate who is running for some office. I forget whether it's senator or some long shot candidate for president on a guaranteed basic income. And it's a complicated question because the case for it is that we are not doing a good enough job sharing the gains, which are enormous from globalization, with everybody. And so that seems a way to do it. My own view is, and I've talked about this a lot with Ryan Salam, who is a great policy writer and who's got a new book coming out about immigration. My conviction is to oppose the idea because I think it is so important that people work. Work is not just a way to earn a living. It's a source of meaning. It's a source of stability. It's the thing out of which family grows. And, that it's one thing to subsidize work or for the government, even in a sufficiently severe emergency, to generate jobs, whether or not they strictly need to be done. But to pay people not to work, I think is just soul destroying. So mark me down as a nay on any kind of minimum income or guaranteed basic. I'm about to spend a year in Colombia. What macroeconomic policies should be prioritized to move a developing economy forward as quickly as possible? This is a question I've thought about a lot without reaching any kind of answer. I spent some time in Peru about 18 years ago. I ghost wrote fantastic book by Hernando de Soto called The Mystery of Capital. I want to say Ghost wrote. I mean, he did all the research and all the thinking. I just brought order to it. It was a wonderful assignment. It is not always true that when you work on someone else's book, that you come away from that experience thinking this guy is an even greater man than I realized, having worked so closely with him, he's an even greater man than he was when I thought he was when he started. But I truly admire him. Hernando emphasizes above all the point of legibility of property rights. And he has this very vivid thing that he would do. He would take him to the slums around Lima, or not the slums, but the poorer neighborhoods. And what you see, or on the slopes, that there would be all of these concrete dwellings made out of concrete cinder blocks, and then there'd be rebar sticking out above the roof line, with then cinder blocks stacked all around the rebar. It was really ugly. And he said, "Why do you think people do that?" And I don't know. It doesn't look very nice. He said, they know it doesn't look very nice. The problem is that the people who live in these dwellings do not have enough cash to be able to have even the minimum, lowest possible amount that a Peruvian bank will accept for a deposit. So the way they save funds is that, whenever they have a bit of money, they buy 3 or 4 extra concrete blocks. And when they have accumulated enough concrete blocks, that's when they build the second floor. But they are locked out of the banking system. And so a lot of his work was about finding ways to bring people into the banking system. So I think we focus a lot when we look at the underdeveloped countries at macroeconomics. We tend to think of macroeconomics as hard and microeconomics as simple. But making sure that every committed person is able to have entry into a functional market economy with secure property rights, that may be more important than all of those complex macroeconomic questions about inflation and budget balance and free trade. Making sure that creating an environment in which, instead of stacking up concrete blocks, that poor people in a country like Colombia, Peru, are able to put money in a bank and have cash savings, even in amounts that look quite small by developed country standards. That may be the most important thing. Barring a trade war, what would be the best way to confront China's unfair trade practice? All right, so this is one of the places where I really start raging against the Trump administration. A great way to do it would be to build a coalition of like-minded countries around the rim of the Pacific and have them write a trade agreement, one with another, setting standards and practices without a Chinese veto, and bringing in not just developed countries like the United States, Canada, and Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, but also emerging markets, Malaysia, and even Vietnam, which is a tough country to bring in. And have all of these countries work together and say, here we've got a standard set of rules and practices for the Pacific region, which we wrote without reference to China. China's welcome to join at some point in the future if it lives up to these rules, but we're not going to let you play the same games that you played within the World Trade Organization. I don't know, what would we call that? Why don't we call it the Trans-Pacific Partnership? And that's the plan. And it started in the Bush administration. It was brought to fruition under President Obama, and it was the right answer. And it was just malevolently and maliciously and also ignorantly blown up by Trump in his first week in office. And we're going to have to do the next proper president is going to have to do all of that work all over again. Okay, where are we here? A good friend, Susan from Atlanta. What about Brexit? So the person who asked me this question, I know has views on Brexit that are somewhat different from mine. I'm really worried about Brexit. Not that I doubt that Britain will be fine in the long run. It's got a highly educated population. It's got the greatest location on earth. It's got London. It's got all kinds of amazing long-term assets, and I'm sure it will be fine. The case for against Brexit was not that Britain would be fine outside the EU. It was getting from here to there. It was going to involve a lot of chaos and misery. And I kept thinking, for what? Why are you doing this to yourself? That you're just going to end up at the end of the process where you could have been without the 10 years of misery. And Brexit just involves millions of tiny problems, none of which is beyond the capacity of the British to solve. But why you'd want to solve all of them and all of them at the same time? And the example that that I think is most dramatic is you know, because Britain's not in Schengen, because every truck or rail car that passes between Britain and the continent has to be inspected. And they go through, mostly they go through the channel. And when the channel was built, a deal was struck between the British and the French that the sidings, the place where the inspections would happen would be on the French side. So if you're a truck that's going between Britain and France, whether you're going into Britain or out of Britain, whether you're a rail car going into Britain and out of Britain, you do your inspection on the French side. So they built an area to do that. How big is that area? It's 600 hectares, and it's got like 40 kilometers of fencing around it. It's enormous, but it's now like a dozen years later. It's already approaching capacity, and a new facility is going to need to be built. Well, under the deal, which is written under EU auspices, that new facility will also have to be built on the French side. But if Britain exits, everything's up for grabs, and the French are saying we think that the new car park or truck park should be on the British side in Kent, the most crowded place on earth, and probably the place on earth where, after colonial Williamsburg, it's most impossible to build anything. And the French are pushing the British. No, you are going to have to find another 600 hectares with 40 kilometers of fencing in Kent. And all of this, and by the way, if this does not all go perfectly smoothly, again, I'm relying here on what I've read, the average truck or rail car is inspected for 2 minutes. If that inspection were to go from 2 minutes to 4 minutes, that would create a traffic jam that would stretch all the way from the entrance to the channel back to central London. And again, there are solutions, but you have to solve it at the same time as you're solving air traffic control and the problem of nuclear isotopes, which is the nuclear industry is regulated by the Europeans, and food safety and every other problem. For what? I don't understand it. I don't understand how anybody's going to be better off at the end of it. And maybe I'm not as sensitive as I can to the majesty of English and British history, but it just seemed to me way more trouble than it was worth. It was like it's like solving a problem that was already solved, and then just for the sake of solving problems. And I think life throws at you enough problems that are unavoidable that you don't volunteer for more. I grew up in the county, somebody's saying. What are your thoughts on George W. Bush campaigning for Republicans for the midterm election? That's a great question. I can imagine how torn George W. Bush feels. I mean, the Republican Party, they might as well rename it after his family. It's 3 generations: his father, his grandfather, and himself, his father's grandfather. And many of these people were, fighting in desperate fights, are people who are really loyal to him and who have done favors for him, and how it must feel to watch this happening. At the same time, who can despise Donald Trump more than George W. Bush, and who can be more aghast by the direction in which Trump is leading? So I've spent a lot of time around politicians. I have a lot of admiration and use for them, and they're different kinds of people from everybody else, but they have a really important skill. Politicians are specialists in the gaining of democratic consent. And that is an indispensable art. And they have a code of loyalty and commitment that is very different from that which you have in other areas of life. And Trump has tested these people in ways that many of them are quite unprepared to deal with. And of course, we always, as human beings, want to believe when we confront some new and frightening thing is maybe it's not as new and not as frightening as it looks. Maybe it's something that we can assimilate to our experience in the past, especially for those of us who are older or for whom the Republican Party is precious. That is a more powerful temptation. And I think President Bush is caught in that, even as I don't think he's fooled for 1 minute by what Donald Trump is. Where are we going here? How about a live chat someday exclusively in politics? Okay, all right, that's a dare. Let's do that. What are your plans for the centennial of Armistice Day? That's this viewer knows I'm a World War I obsessive. The First World War is something that we have a lot of family connections to. So my wife's stepfather, but her father. He raised Peter Worthington, fought in World War II in Korea, and her grandfather, F.F. Worthington, served on the Western Front in the First World War and was then a very important leader in the Second World War. He was the creator of the Canadian Armored Corps. And he was on the Western Front from 1916 to 1918, repeatedly wounded, decorated many times. And her grandfather on her mother's side was also on the Western Front, although he had a much more terrible war. He survived the war, but his stomach and lungs were burned out by poison gas, and he was never the same man after. And it's just always, and maybe this is a Canadian thing, it's always sort of haunted my imagination. Our, the beginning of the 100 Days, the campaign that the Germans in the spring of 1918 did this last lunge westward, having knocked Russia out of the war, and they were fought to a stalemate by the British and Americans, and then a series of battles were fought in the summer. First Battle of the Marne, and then in August the counteroffensive begins. The 100 Days that ends with the victory. And my wife's grandfather was a hero and leader in that campaign. So I will think on November 11th about all of that, but I'll also think about this. I guess now 3 years ago, I took my son on a tour of the Western Front. We started up in Belgium, and we drove the whole circuit all the way down to Verdun. It took us 2 weeks, and we toured a lot of battlefields. And then I think we finished near Verdun, and then we have one last day, and we have to get from Verdun, which is the bottom of the Franco-German border. We have to get back to Brussels Airport. We're going to fly out of. And our rental car, we get from Verdun all the way back to Brussels. We have a stop, and we do another tour, but like direction to direction, it took 2.5 hours on a motorway. We passed through France, we passed through Luxembourg, we passed through Germany, and we passed through Brussels. We didn't slow down because there are no customs between any of those countries. And you think, what was this all about? What was this all about? That we tore the world apart, and the solution was just within our hands. We just had to not be such jerks. And man, the suffering it took to persuade people just not to be such jerks. But what a stupendous thing it is. I remember when Schengen was new. I went to a conference in a town in Alsace sponsored by the French army. And I don't speak French, but I can understand it well enough to get through a conference. And it's in this town called Colmar, this very quaint town. And it's right on the Rhine. And Schengen was, and anyway, so for exercise, I rented a bike and went biking through the hills above Colmar. And then there's you can get to Germany. So I couldn't quite believe in the reality of Schengen. As at the end of my ride, having gone uphill for the exercise, I went down the hill. I went to the border, crossing Germany, and I crossed back and forth. And nobody asked me any questions. This is Alsace. And at the dinner session, the French military institutes, of course, half the officers are present are German. I was talking to one of them in English. So it's just so amazing, so moving to be here in Alsace and to go back and forth between this undefended, peaceful border between Germany and France, more open than the U.S.-Canadian border. And he said, yeah. I said, I looked at this German army officer, look back on it. I said, I've never been able to understand what that was all about anyway. I mean, if you want a house in Alsace, you can just buy one. Do you care who delivers the mail? That's what I'll be thinking about on November 11th. One more, and then I think I have to go. And so do you. Let's find the right one. Okay, there's so many here. I'm sorry. How can we overturn Citizens United and reduce big money in political campaigns? The 2016 election raises an interesting question about money in campaigns. I mean, Donald Trump was the small dollar candidate. I think all in all, he raised less than half as much money as Hillary Clinton did, and he raised way more money in donations under $200. It's always worth remembering that while we sanctify the small dollar donor, I guess $200 is still a lot of money for a lot of people. And the kind of people who give $200, or Bernie Sanders' famous $26, we'd like to think they're like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, good citizens. They tend to be ideological fanatics. And that when you have a small dollar system, they end up being a much more radical system than the big dollar system. And one of the stories of campaign finance reform is we keep chasing from the evils we have and running into evils that we have not imagined. So here's the thing I think about a lot, and I don't have an answer here, but I just raise this for your consideration. So before 1974, there are almost no rules on campaign finance at all. I mean, corporations were not allowed to give to candidates. That was one rule. But there are no limits. It was legal to give in cash. You could take a suitcase or a paper. Lyndon Johnson, there's a famous story about him getting paper bags full of money from oil industry. You take money in cash, so it's completely untraceable. There were no rules at all, or hardly any, before 1974. And yet, even though there were no rules, big money seemed to count for a lot less in the no-rule world pre-74 than it does in the world of the 1974 reforms, then McCain-Feingold, and all the rest. So why before 1974 did money count for so little when theoretically it could have done whatever it wanted? And the answer I come up with is, well, what would you do with money before 1974? That the thing you wanted was to get voters to the polls. Well, that's what unions did that, and they did it for free. And for on the Republican side, church organizations and fraternal organizations did it, and they did it for free. But the most valuable things that happened in politics happened because of people's mutual associational commitments that were denominated non-cash. I mean, you could buy more TV ads, but in the end, I think that most political experts agree that after a certain point, TV ads only serve to enrich the people who make them and the TV stations that broadcast them. They have no impact on the election. If you're going to get money out of politics, how do you get people to the polls? In a world in which unions are gone, those associations are gone, in which you have to pay for things that were done on a volunteer basis back in 1950, that's going to draw in the money. I mean, get out the vote, voter registration, all of that has to be paid for. And in 1950, it just didn't. So money in politics is a problem, but it's also a symptom of another problem, which is the decline of associational life in America. And I don't know the answer to that question. And it's one of the most haunting questions that we have entirely. It's now past 9 o'clock. It's such a pleasure. I don't want to overstay my welcome. But we'll do this again about Canadian politics. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm very grateful to you. Thank you for reading Trumpocracy. Thank you for your interest in my work. Thank you for being good citizens. I mean, what a thing it is on a Sunday night to do this. I mean, there's so many other things. You could all be watching episode 4 of Succession, which is what I'll be doing later tonight. But I'm honored that you would spend any part of your Sunday evening with me. Thank you.